ISIS was having more than 30,000 militants from 90 countries, and ISIS was effectively using social media accounts, like more than 11,000 Twitter accounts to radicalize and then to recruit people for the organization. More than 30% of Mexican territory have been controlled by the Mexican cartels. And these cartels are acting like de facto states. So they provide employment and they are involved in dispute resolutions and they provide social assistance.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Inside National Security by the National Security Academy. Today, we have a very interesting conversation. Mahmut Cengiz, it's very nice to speak with you. He's a distinguished professor at George Mason University. He heads a lot of scholarly work there. He worked with the State Department and so forth. He focuses on the Middle East, looking at the academic side of terrorism, counterterrorism, prevention, and so forth. So it's great to sit down with you. Thank you very much for your time, Mahmoud.
Thanks for inviting me. I had a very busy background so far because I was having always several hats. I don't know how it is good for someone to do maybe multiple things at the same time. And what I mean with that, I was in the field and the long years. I was working for Turkish National Police and doing investigations against organized crime groups and then the terrorist financiers. Also, I had a chance to work in the international institutions. I worked for the United Nations. I was in Kosovo in the conflict zones. And then also I was leading some projects when I was in the field in Asia, also in the Middle East. I think one project was about Pakistan, and it was about to modernize and to train the Pakistani police. Then the second hat always I have in my life is teaching. So I have been teaching more than 25 years. And currently I'm teaching American security policy, narco-terrorism, and examining terrorist organizations courses at George Mason University. I really love research, so this is my another interest area. And so far, I was involved in projects with European Union, Brookings Institute, and various U.S. government agencies. And currently, I am the principal investigator for Hubs of Illicit Trade project, which is focusing on some risk points and risk zones of illicit trade worldwide. And also, previously, I was academic director and the co-principal investigator for State Department Global Terrorism Database Project from 2018 to 2025. So 7 years we did this project at George Mason. It was a State Department project. Of course, publications, it is another area for me. And so far I was able to publish 8 books. And then the most recent one was a terrorism textbook. Actually, I wrote this book just for our students at George Mason. So it's about terrorist typologies. And also, additionally, I am a managing editor for Homeland Security Today. And I was able to publish more than 100 articles on organized crime, transnational crime, corruption, and terrorism at Homeland Security Today and at Small Wars Journal.
I know that you spent over 15 years in law enforcement. And
Yeah.
was there a specific operation that you worked on that permanently changed, let's just say, the way that you understand the relationship between transnational crime and terrorism, as they're very interwoven?
Actually, because of my background, because of the several hats in my background so far, I was able to use multiple perspectives and approaches. And for example, my academic hat helped me understand better this organized crime and terrorist issues. For example, I know about this convergence theory. According to this theory, organized crime and terrorist organizations have interactions. So they learn from each other. And what they have learned so far, for example, organized crime groups learned from terrorist organizations how to be violent. So they use some violent tactics from terrorist organizations. I think it was the reason why we saw in the early 1990s how Italian mafia was targeting and assassinating one judge using more than 1,000 pounds of explosives. And then on the other hand, what terrorist organizations learned from organized crime as a result of these interactions, and they learned how to launder money, and they learned how to get involved in illicit trade for financing and for funding. Being aware of these theories, and then when I was in the field, actually, I saw that, for example, in the Middle East, the PKK's involvement in drug trade, and then for example, PKK was taxing drug traffickers in the borderland areas, and also maybe another operation, another example I can give is the Kurdish Hezbollah's involvement in cigarette trafficking. So they were both operations and they were both examples I can tell in this context. So how organized crime had interaction with terrorist organizations.
So what was the impact of ideology and profit? Were they working side to side? Are they two different things? How are they impacted or related to organized crime and terrorist networks?
I think it's really important and crucial for us to combine field experience with academics. So, for example, in this context, I can give another example from my research when I was in Turkish and Syrian border, researching on ISIS and Al Qaeda financing, and also the other groups' terrorist financing. And I saw and how ideology and profit were operating side by side. For example, ISIS was aiming to spread its ideology in those years. I think in 2014 and 2015, at its peak, ISIS was having more than 30,000 militants from 90 countries, and ISIS was effectively using social media accounts, like more than 11,000 Twitter accounts to radicalize and then to recruit people for the organization. Of course, also we know well that most of ISIS militants got radicalized after joining the organization because according to one research, it says that some people they may join terrorist organizations seeking for adventure or money, which was the case also for ISIS. And then after joining the organization, they got, they get radicalized. So it was the case for ISIS as well. So I was seeing, for example, from my interviews that ISIS's, efforts using ideology to radicalize its recruits. But on the other hand, for ISIS's financing, I think also ISIS was considered as one of the most, wealthiest terrorist organization because the group was generating revenue from oil, from antiquities, and from extortion from some other, illicit trade areas. But more specifically for your question, what I can say. Also, I saw that ISIS was involved in illicit antiquities trade, and then also ISIS, had a specific department when generating revenue from these antiquities. Actually, it was a question for all of us how Syrian antiquities under the control of ISIS, how they were ending up in the museums in Europe or even in the US. So, and then of course, ISIS doesn't have any office in Europe or in the US, but the question here is Syrian antiquities ending up in destination countries. Then in my research, so I saw that ISIS in Syria was collaborating with local smugglers and is selling, this antiquities to local smugglers. Then we have seen transnational crimes taking like a very important role. Then with local smugglers, then the transnational criminal organizations in Turkey and also in Europe, I saw they were all involved in transferring the Syrian antiquities from Syria to the destination country. So I think this is an example here showing us how ISIS's ideology and also how ISIS's generating revenue were going at the same time together when the group was operating in Syria.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So, given that you have both the field experience and the academic side with research, would you say, the most dangerous misconceptions that governments hold at the moment about how these modern crime or terror networks actually work?
I think misconceptions actually always there are some learning points for practitioners, also for the academics. That's why we need to close very thoroughly what's going on in the field. And when we look at the misconceptions so far, governments are holding about how modern crime, terror networks functions. I think first we should talk about the importance of networks because these networks are decentralized and the fluid. So we have seen, for example, loosely connected and autonomous nodes rather than a single chain of command. Even ISIS and Al Qaeda are operating using this loosely connected, and the affiliates and also organizations as well. So the second misconception is about economic models, which they often trump ideology because in some cases governments sometimes overemphasize ideological motivations while underestimating criminal entrepreneurship. For example, jihadist organizations, they are not relying on the local donors and then also foreign donors or ideological donations. Also, they are involved in extortion cases, just to fund their activities. Another misconception in this, I think, in this context should be to understand the role of networks, because these networks help exploit legal and technological gray zone. So it's been a new trend, for example, to see how these terrorist organizations use encrypted communications and the dark web platforms, and which have decoupled operation from physical proximity. I think the maybe another misconception could be here overestimating the impact of kinetic actions. The governments may assume that the arrest and the asset seizures or targeted strikes, they will collapse networks. But it's not the case when we have seen, these law enforcement and military operations. For example, if you look at decapitations in the world, so you can target the leader of any organization, even jihadist groups or the cartel groups. But there's a question here how effective it is when you are targeting the leader. And we know from the research that maybe decapitation, targeting the leader in jihadist organizations may not bring some, anticipated results for the law enforcement. So this is the case for cartels as well. And then when you are targeting the cartel leader, it is just getting fragmented, and you can see more cartel members and the more cartel, splinterings, just fighting each other and just killing more and more people.
Very interesting, given especially the fact of all the new advancements we see in Mexico. I think this is very relevant at the moment. So,
Yep.
in your work on Syria, I know that you have extensive work focus on Syria as well. Can you share an example to the audience about how basically the different conflicts, for example, were able to get transformed and perhaps financed by illicit activities, and then they hijacked it, basically these illicit activities, to gain, of course, power in various places, Syria included. So, do you have anything to say about that?
Another great question in this context, how conflict transformed an illicit activity into a strategic source of power. I think in the context of Syria, we should focus on two types of illicit trade.
Mhm.
The first one is oil, and then we should talk about the Captagon trafficking in the regions. So for the oil, we know well that militant groups institutionalized the trade, and for example, ISIS turned oil smuggling into a quasi-state economic system. And instead of simple theft, for example, ISIS created extraction systems, and in most cases using captured engineers and the technicians, and the local refineries. They were rudimentary but very effective financial resource for ISIS. And also ISIS created taxation and the licensing systems for traders and the truck drivers. And the last one here, I think, is smuggling routes also created by ISIS through Syria, Iraq, and occasionally into regional black markets. And also, oil control became a military objective in this context, and because oil fields became strategic battlefields, and I think the groups in Syria, they know well that whoever controlled them gained revenue streams and the patronage networks with local tribes and the leverage over electricity and the fuel supplies and the recruitment incentives. And what about Captagon? Actually, Captagon, originally the pharmaceutical fentanyl, so it was produced in Eastern European countries, but after the launch of civil war in Syria, so this also illicit trade moved Syria, because we know well from the conflict zones that when we are focusing on terrorism or insurgency, so we create sometimes vacuums, and these vacuums may be immediately filled by criminal actors, like in the case of Captagon trafficking moving from Eastern Europe to Syria. And starting from the early 2010s, militia groups and then the rebel groups, as well as some Iran-backed groups, Hezbollah, they were involved in this Captagon trafficking in Syria. It was not limited actually the involvement of these militia groups and the rebel groups, also we saw how Captagon became a source for Syrian government. I think Bashar al-Assad's brother, he was running a big uh, scheme in the country, and he was leading this Captagon trafficking in the country. So, what we can say, this oil and the Captagon, so they really, uh, they are transformed the drug this trade from a criminal activity into a geopolitical bargaining chip and the survival mechanisms.
Right. And if we now, for example, change to a new region, let's say looking at Latin America as a whole, I know that there the cartels, they exercise immense territorial power and they have a lot of political influence as well. And what lessons, especially in the realm of counterterrorism, would you say that don't apply there that usually would apply in other countries or in other regions?
I think lessons here that counterterrorism from counterterrorism that they apply. I think the first one should be about the targeting the financial ecosystems, not just the fighters. And what we have learned so far, counterterrorism models, the most effective one is targeting the financial systems. And in the case of, for example, Latin America and the cartels, these cartels depend on complex financial pipelines, money laundering, trade-based money laundering, shell companies, and the cryptocurrency transfer. So I think the second one here, we should really understand the network-based intelligence. Even ISIS and Al Qaeda, they operate in loosely connected affiliates and the cells. So this is the case for the cartels as well. And today's cartels, for example, they are operating through distributed cells and the subcontractors rather than a rigid chain of command. So network analysis helps authorities identify, for example, brokers and the logistics coordinators, and the corruption nodes here is very important inside government institutions and the transport and smuggling intermediaries. I think here, what lessons from counterterrorism that to apply. The third one should be governance and the local legitimacy matter, because we know in Mexico case, more than 30% of Mexican territory have been controlled by the Mexican cartels. And these cartels are acting like de facto states. So they provide employment and they are involved in dispute resolutions and they provide social assistance. That's why it is really important for us if we aim to defeat armed networks. I think we should really take into consideration restoring state legitimacy and the services. And then the second part of the question, and where counterterrorism approaches fall short. I think here we should talk about the leadership. The capitation often backfires. Like your point in Mexico, 2 weeks ago, Jalisco generation leader El Mancho, he got killed in a military operation. But then we discuss about the effectiveness of this military operation. Maybe it may disrupt maybe some level of group activity. But the final question here, what about short-term and the long-term impacts of this decapitation and targeting using kingpin strategy against this Mexican cartel? So I believe, in most cases, like one approach falling short, the fragmentations after the decapitations, after the targeting the cartel leaders. I think also the second one here, in terms of counterterrorism approaches. Last year, the Trump administration designated cartels as terrorist organizations. I think in the last year, there are more than 20 in the cartels and the gangs officially designated by US government. Until that time, and the scholars were focusing on two big differences, because according to definition, terrorist organizations, the ultimate goal is ideology, and for cartels, the ultimate goal is financial enrichment. But I think after the designations, after stretching terrorism definitions, now I think we talk about the closeness between cartels and the terrorist organizations. So I think also we should really understand well that cartels are profit driven, so they can easily replace members, so they can have alliances and shift rapidly. Also, they the violence is often instrumental rather than ideological. I think also in this context, the last point could be demand side drivers remained untouched. When countering terrorism, this is not a priority for military law enforcement to address the demand side. But for the cartels, we should definitely look at the demand side because now they are designated as terrorist organizations, but we know well that this is a simple economic model, supply and demand. As long as there is demand, as long as we are not addressing effectively the demand side, on the supply side, always we will see the resourceful and opportunistic groups like cartels, always providing or transferring some drugs or some other things demanded by addicts. So that's why it is really crucial for us to understand demand side, and then it shouldn't be remain untouched if you want to be effective in counterterrorism strategies.
Yeah, Latin America is definitely a very interesting region, often not so much driven in ideology like the Middle East, but huge problems when it comes to especially drug trafficking and other illicit activities that one has to stop, right? So that's very interesting. Now, if we focus on one very important issue, which is asylum, immigration, and so forth, I know that in Europe especially, they're having quite a few problems there, given the immigration that is coming, especially from these war-torn areas. So my
Yeah.
question is that how do these large-scale asylum and immigration flows from these conflict affected areas and regions shape both security dynamics, but also the social stability of nations, such as in Europe? And what is usually, in your eyes, misunderstood in this asylum and immigration debate?
Yep. This is another popular topic, the border security in the Western world. Also, even in the US, we have seen so many debates about the border security. But great point on the security dynamics and the social stability. So what I can say for security dynamics, always there are pressures on border systems, and we know well that large migration flows strain border control and asylum processing. And the governments must screen many people quickly while maintaining security checks. So in rare cases, but we know that militants try to use migration routes. For example, after the November 2015 Paris attacks, European authorities increased scrutiny of refugee routes. So in terms of criminal exploitation under security dynamics, and then this growing sector also brought some opportunities for human smugglers. So today they are highly involved in this human smuggling in Europe, also in Latin America as well. So what about social stability? And always we have seen this pressures on services, and in many cases, rapid population increases can strain housing, schools, and healthcare. And if government manage integration poorly, in many cases, tensions may rise in local communities. So what about economic contribution? So and in some cases also, these migrants can strengthen economies, like it happened in 2015 by the Germany government. So the German government have integrated many refugees into training programs and the jobs after the 2015 European migrant crisis. So what is often uh, misunderstood? So there's a common belief that these refugees and also these asylum seekers they're they're aliens or they are criminals. But this is not the case according to data, according to international reports. So we know, for example, according to research, that these refugees or these asylum seekers, they are rarely involved in terrorism or serious crime. So in the common, for example, in the Western world, there's a common belief that these loosely protected borders are helping these terrorists and criminals crossing the borders and then ending up in their destination countries. But this is not something else we have seen backed by some research and data. I think here we should really focus on the integration problems, and then after their arrival, for example, poor integration, unemployment, and the social isolation can create tensions.
Yeah.
I think in this context Maybe we can talk about the maybe refugee and asylum policies in France, because according to data, France is the country with the most lone actor attacks by these the refugees and by these asylum seekers. I think here the lesson is to question about this integration, maybe policies. So this is maybe another important area, the real challenge more on the integration.
Yes, definitely a big challenge. I remember living in Germany, and in just a matter of 10 years, especially when a mass migration from asylum-seeking countries arrived, that all the Christmas markets basically had to put pillars in order to protect the Christmas markets, right? And so that, of course, within society creates a sense of that there might be an issue which happens, which often does happen, where there are terrorist attacks, unfortunately. So, in your experience as well, I would like that we speak about corruption, right? So, is corruption simply a facilitator of terrorism and trafficking? Or would you say it's actually the structural foundation that allows these ecosystems to survive in the first place?
Yeah, I think this is another great question in terms of countering cartels and organized crime and terrorism. We should really understand the role of corruption. And in today's world, according to the Corruption Perception Index, there are many countries listed as the corrupt countries, but in these countries, we have seen criminal organizations and terrorist organizations are operating and also are getting more and more opportunities. Of course, corruption facilitates organized crime and the terrorism by allowing groups to bypass laws and the enforcement. In terms of its structural foundation, and the corruption often begins as a facilitator, but over time it becomes the structural backbone of illicit ecosystems. In many countries, we know, for example, well that the state actors and the brokers or some other government officials are involved in the illicit trade, maybe activities. I think this is showing us more how it is a structural foundational issue and how it is facilitating, I mean, organized crime and the terrorist activities in the world.
My last question along these lines would be looking at the future, so looking ahead. What would you say, looking at emerging developments that we see technological, we're seeing mass geopolitical landscapes now coming into the forefront, and financial developments as well, is which one out of these is most likely to redefine the relationship between organized crime and terrorism in the next decade or so?
I think recently there has been a confusion
Yeah.
after designating cartels and the gangs, after stretching terrorism definition. That's why, again, we need to draw new lines about the definitions about counter terrorism and counter cartel or organized crime techniques worldwide. And in the next decade, we will focus more on the expansion of digital financial systems and particularly cryptocurrencies and
Mhm.
the decentralized finance. And the financial transformation, this is really important because we know about these cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and the Monero, both allow actors to move money across borders quickly and with limited oversight. I think also we should talk about technology and the dark web because online marketplaces and today from terrorism area, social media is really considered as a platform radicalizing people. Also, the social media and the online markets places on the dark web also enable the sale of weapons and the forged documents and then hacking services. That's why, as a strategic implication, governments will need to stronger financial intelligence, cyber monitoring, and international cooperation to track these digital transactions.
I know that you worked for the State Department for various years and led very successful operations, especially in the realms of data and so forth. Could you please speak more about that? That'd be great.
Yep. Actually, it was a GTEC project, Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, and it was an acronym. So this global terrorism database has been around since the early 1980s. And in 1983, State Department congressionally was mandated to submit its annex of statistical information report to the Congress. And in most cases, State Department used data and then the data from global terrorism database projects. And from 2012 until 2017, Maryland University with the START Center was hosting this data set in 2018 at George Mason Track Center and GTEC Center. We took over this data in 2018 and did this data until 2025. And actually training our young scholars and our students, our analysts. So I think more than 70 students processed data, and some of them ended up in a very critical government position. So we were so happy also contributing to the futures, also young experts and young scholars. And in this data, we recorded more than 60,000 terrorism cases. Now it is still open to public. So gtech.com, you can easily download and get access to this 60,000 data. So also in the last year, after the designations, for the first time in the US, we added processing data about the cartels, and then we included more than 1,500 cartel violence in this data as well. Also, another additional contribution by GTEC to State Department database project was creating some categories. So starting from 2021, we added some categories. For example, jihadists, maybe left wing, right wing, and Iran-backed militia, or some other types of terrorism. And I can maybe give you some interesting results from this database. For example, for the jihadist terrorism, every year GTEC data recorded around 35 or 40% of terrorist incidents were conducted by jihadist terrorist organizations. And interestingly, what we saw, for example, Iran-backed militia groups in the Middle East, and we were very closely tracking the violence by various Iran-backed militia groups. And for example, it was before October 7 terror attacks, it was 5 or 6%. But then, for example, in 2024, we recorded like this 30% of attacks were by Iran-backed militia groups in this database. So it was a great opportunity for all of us to track the most terrorism trends, and also to track just to maybe the most terrorism maybe cases in the world at this project.
That is very interesting, great initiative. And to collect this data is, I think, of course, very pivotal, especially that so many young people, new analysts and so forth can join. And it's a great pipeline, it seems, for them to secure future government positions and so forth. So I think with that, we covered quite a bit of ground. We looked at terrorism, we looked at various regions in the world, from the Middle East to Latin America to Europe. I think this has been a very productive conversation. So thank you very much for your time. And perhaps if the audience would like to look into getting one of your books, are they available for purchase if they want to learn more about these topics?
Yeah, of course, yeah, they're available for purchases. Thanks for inviting me.